Sit closer, okay.
Yes,
Is this your paper, maybe? Do you
Actually, I
want
want to
it?
sit here because at one point I'll be
Yeah,
reading
sure.
from the
But do you
slide.
want your notes, maybe?
Yes, I do, of course.
This is mine. Do you want coffee? Do you want me to bring coffee?
So you're meeting up the decision? I need to be at the hotel at 4 with my luggage in the taxi.
Okay, so we're starting our actually last session with our keynote speaker, Bogdan Stefanescu. I always put the wrong stress on your first name, I'm sorry, because you've been Polonized.
Colonized.
For the colonized, you know, in good cause. And Bogdan is from the University of Bucharest, and I wanted to show you a book because he's the author of one of few monographs on. Is this one? Okay, I don't know this one actually. I don't know this one, not the one that is circulating over there. Few monographs on post-communist, post-colonial convergences and divergences and problems and various common causes, etc. So a very interesting book that is circulating, and I will not make it any longer. Please say what you have to say to us, and then we'll take questions, which can also be, I think, the wrapping up discussion, so to Bogdan and to the whole event. Yeah.
Thank you, Dorota, for the introduction, for having me here, for the honor of being a keynote speaker. Of course, I'm the last keynote speaker, which is no fun.
It's an honor.
You must all be very tired by now. And the previous keynote speakers have raised the bar so high that my talk is doomed to be anticlimactic. So thank you for that, Vyacheslav. It became clear by now, I think, during this conference that the political phenomenon we're dealing with is called by different names. It's new or refurbished nationalism, it's populism, it's xenophobia, it's liberal democracy, it's whatever else. So, after all, what's in a name? Yeah, as Shakespeare would put it. Wouldn't the new nationalist smell as ranked by any other name? Perhaps, but names are important in the human world. Roses may bud and bloom and die oblivious of their name, but humans are in the habit of killing one another. For a name and in the name of something or somebody. And often it is the name that we see and evaluate rather than the actual person or thing being named. And even more than that, the name maketh the man. The words take on a life of their own. And this is not just poetry or an outdated notion of honor. This is what pragmatic theories of speech acts, for instance, and performativity of language tell us. Or the notion of, you were talking about Lakoff, the metaphors we live by, or critical discourse analysis, or social and Foucauldian constructivism. So perhaps it would be interesting to look at the name, the history of this coinage, new nationalism, right? We all know it. Perhaps we should have been talking about the new nationalism. Or maybe the new nationalists, because there's been a series of new nationalists so far. To distinguish them from Theodore Roosevelt's doctrine of 1910, a socialistic, right, the opponent's name, political philosophy to counterbalance the laissez-faire style in U.S. politics, which meant government regulated or centralized economy, increased federal power, upholding the interest of the underprivileged and the powerless, social justice, roughly a welfare state policy. Remember his words, the executive power as the steward of public welfare. Interestingly, Obama took up the same ideas in 2011, speaking publicly in the very same town, Osawatomie, Kansas, where Roosevelt delivered his new nationalism speech. And this is what Obama had to say. Economic inequality also distorts our democracy. It gives an outsized voice to the few who can afford high-priced lobbyists and unlimited campaign contributions, and runs the risk of selling out the democracy to the highest bidder. And it leaves everyone else rightly suspicious that the system in Washington is rigged against them, that our elected representatives aren't looking out for the interest of most Americans. Isn't that populism? It was called populism. Just like Teddy Roosevelt, politics was called populist. So as you can see, there's an overlap, at least in American politics, there's an overlap between the concepts of nationalism, or new nationalism, and populism. Right? The populism of the People's Party, the Progressive Party, and so on. Not derogatory terms at all. And such political attitudes have a relatively dignified tradition there. Now, let's look at another tradition. The newest tradition, right? People talking about these new nationalisms, the phrase that we are using, right? The new nationalism is picked up from a more recent situation. One possible origin, or one possible simply instance of people using this new nationalism coinage in a new way, is an article, an editorial in The Economist, 2016. Trump's World, the New Nationalism.
We were first. With our
When you look at that, you realize that the category is still very troublesome, right? In pairing Trump with other ethnocentric chauvinists on the rise in the world today, Putin, Erdogan, Islamic, Hindu, Chinese nationalisms, the columnist introduces a series of prejudices and cliches, misnomers that usually distract us from understanding the true nature of this new and dangerous political trend. Here's one. Nationalism is chauvinism. And there you have the quotation. Welcome to the new nationalism. For the first time since the Second World War, the great and rising powers are simultaneously enthralled to the various sorts of chauvinism. Right? And then he goes on to recycle another old misconception. That there's a distinction between good or civic nationalism and bad or ethnic one. Right? And you can see the description that he's providing. Civic nationalism is conciliatory, forward-looking. Ethnic nationalism is zero-sum, aggressive, nostalgic. Draws on race. What set nations apart. And in its darkest hour in the first half of the 20th century, ethnic nationalism led to war. Now, each of these stereotypes sounds okay to us, actually. But if you combine them, they don't make any sense, as he does in this editorial. If nationalism is chauvinism, and nationalism can be either bad or good, then you have good and bad chauvinism. Where's the logic in that? Here's another prejudice in the article that goes on. Nationalism and the European Union, right, are mutually exclusive. Okay? You have there the quote. The EU project is naturally endangered in the mind of the colonists by Brexit and by the xenophobic ultranationalism of Hungary and Poland. Mind you, there is no adjective, there is no qualifier attached to Brexit. But Hungary and Poland are xenophobic ultranationalistic. Right? Although Brexit itself was, at home in Britain, cold ultranationalist, accused of blood and bitter reactionary nationalism. Why the difference? The subtle difference in discourse? I think that the explanation is another prejudice. Western nationalism is okay. Eastern European nationalism is reprehensible. And that there's a long scholarly tradition for that idea. Now, why am I calling these prejudices or misnomers? because by now they have become part of the conventional wisdom in the public intellectual domain. An unchallenged, and I'm quoting now Anton Levin from King College, London, an unchallenged, vulgar, and didactic form of the constructivist theory of nationalism. Many historians, sociologists, politologists, and even anthropologists have taken such preconceptions as creeds and axioms that need not be subjected to falsifiability tests. And existing logical or empirical counter-arguments from a lot of other scholars are completely disregarded in public discourse. And this happens even in scholarly discourse on nationalism, which has become more and more polemical, verging on ideology and political pamphlet. A number of established scholars have provided logical and empirical arguments against these academic myths. We call them academic myths to refer to uncritical, simplistic, polemical, militant cliches, posing as rigorously tested and consistent academic savvy. So, let's take them again one by one. Yeah, nationalism is chauvinism. There's a number of experts, there's a number of scholars studying nationalism that said nationalism is not mindless, unfettered emotion, but it's a form of collective self-consciousness, self-identification, therefore a form of reflexivity. Okay? And this is proven by a lot of pronouncements, historical pronouncements from the people you see there. Mill, Lord Acton, Renan, Mazzini, right? That nationalism is not necessarily xenophobia and chauvinism, right? Good nationalism versus bad nationalism, right? You have people like Anthony Smith, right? In fact, he says, in fact, every nationalism contains civic and ethnic elements in varying degrees and different forms. Sometimes civic and territorial elements predominate. At other times, it is the ethnic and the vernacular components that are emphasized. And he gives them some examples, right? A lot of other people saying the same thing. Important names. Nationalism and the European Union are mutually exclusive, right? You have there examples of scholars proving that that's not the case. And also, to satisfy those who are interested in numbers and polls and statistical evidence, there is, at one point, there was a comprehensive survey of public opinion in all applicant states. Yeah? That showed high levels of national pride did not prevent high levels of European pride. Yeah? People are saying that certain European states have seen the EU not as an opponent of their nationalism, but as a new vehicle for them. Nationalism is not necessarily chauvinism, right? But national project. Okay. Western nationalism is okay. Eastern European nationalism is reprehensible. Let's take, for instance, just like Greenfield. He claimed the distinction between Western and Eastern types of nationalism makes little sense geographically. Why? Because, as she said, if we assign individual societies to any of these originally geographical categories on the basis of civilizational characteristics, we might have to characterize many Western European societies as Eastern Europe, while most of the West or Europe would paradoxically move to another continent. Obviously the States, yeah, the American continent. Right? And, you know, Stefan Howard talking about how John Stuart Mill actually advocated, yeah, the supporter of civic nationalism, advocated the absorption of inferior cultures into the dominant nationality of a country, and how he mounted on an elaborate defense of British colonialism, as opposed to Bad Herder, right, who objected to the claims of superiority of certain cultures on the grounds that at bottom, all comparison between nations is out of place. Every nation has its center of happiness within itself. So why are we not paying attention to what all these people are saying? Why are we disregarding the host of conceptual and empirical arguments provided by these people? I'm not saying side with them. I'm not saying accept what they have to say. I'm saying simply consider what they have to say. And when you come up with the notion that nationalism is chauvinism, explain why those counter-arguments are not convincing. Why do we keep treating nationalism as chauvinism, a threat to the cosmopolitanism, to the European Union? Why do we use the term to name xenophobes, racists, and anti-liberal demagogues? Well, I have a couple of answers at least that I'm going to suggest, but just for the sake of discussions, one simple answer is for ideological reasons. That is for non or insufficiently critical reasons. An ideological West-centric bias, which is founded on idyllic, cliched civic national democracies, has been warping scholarly evaluation. German Nazis, Italian fascism, the brutality of Basque and Northern Ireland separatism, these are exceptions, abnormalities in the history of the West. Whereas for Central and East European history, ethno-nationalism is taken to define the very historical nature and development of the region. Another answer, and we've been talking about this with Raoul, is for the sake of expedience. It's easier to accept that that's the case because so many people are saying that, so why contradict, why try to explain stuff? We'll just, go with the flow. I think perhaps we might have been misrepresenting nationalism all this time. Nationalism, I think, is much more complicated, complex, and contradictory. It's a process of consistently constructing a national identity which has very little to do with a simplistic, schematic, derogatory use of the term nationalism that has become so widespread. Perhaps that's why embracing this approach called discursive constructivism that might perhaps offer a new perspective. Now, we've seen the importance of discursive constructivism and its models throughout the conference. And it's part of what has been called a cultural or even discursive turn in the social and political sciences. So, the reasoning goes something like, if nations are imagined communities, as Benedict Anderson says, that is, subjective constructs, imagined, right? Then they are constructed through or as discourse. Therefore, nations are discursive constructs. And there's lots of people saying that, right? Anderson, Hall, Homi Bhabha, Billy, right? Banal nationalism, Craig Calhoun, right? A lot. And especially Ruth Voda, right? The discursive constructivism represented by scholars like Voda is part of a new set of approaches from different disciplinary quarters that draw the image of discourse as what I have called a thought, speech, action continuum. Representations of reality are present to our mind as speech, and they generate rather than simply reflect the reality both to our minds and in the world. In other words, you do things with words, as Austin put it, right? So I'm working along some of the important points made by Ruth Voda and her co-authors in The Discursive Construction of National Identity, a wonderful book. Nations and national identities are discursive constructs. There are several discourses on national identity that interact in the same public space. The national self-images are dynamic results of interactions between these competing versions of the nation. So now let's look at how these words we've been using look like from this perspective. Nation, nationalism, right? A nation is the result of an unstable, multicentric interplay of several national images in the public sphere. What is a national image? A form of collective self-identification that is an encultured discursive representation of one's own putative community whose history and political agenda are conceived as unified and compatible with each other. Such a collective self-image is based on how subjects conceive their relationship with cultural others, various cultural others. Okay, nationalism is the process of consistently and collaboratively reshaping, through reflection, a discursive communal identity, i.e. a national image. And it consists in developing and harmonizing ideologically the historical self-narrative of a group with its political strategy for the future, and also in enculturating that identity through authoritative propagation and reiteration. Okay, so nationalism is, as Professor Erickson puts it in his book on nationalism, a political form of reflection. All right. Now I've devised an analytical grid that I'm using to distinguish between these different nationalisms, working at the same time within the same national public space. You can look at them as stylistic matrices for ideological positions on nationalism as well. This is just for the sake of illustration. I'm not going to go into the details of this analytical grid. What is important for me is to look at the master tropes, a concept I've taken from Hayden White, right? And changed it a bit, played with it a bit, to make it more relevant for the way in which we represent self versus other. Okay? And I've combined that, it was helpful, right, to look at his master tropes by using François Hartog's imagological distinction of how cultural self and cultural other are seen in Herodotus, right? And that is through inversion and analogy. Okay? So the resulting scheme of master tropes is the use of antitheses to represent this relationship, the use of simile, metaphor, and irony. So these are four major ways in which you can represent this relationship between the self and the other. And I had some examples from American, national, traditional U.S. national images, and the recent one as well, to show how this works, how antithesis works. For instance, inversion, yeah, typical oppositions by which you define American character by opposing it to something that is the inverse image of Americanism. Yeah, you have some examples there. Mind you, antithesis, right? This looks like antagonism. This doesn't have to be exclusionary. It doesn't have to be chauvinistic in any way. It simply focuses differently on national character. It places a different focus. The focus is explained as the opposite of another national character. And then you have analogical nationalism, the master trope being simile, right? An interesting way in which you focus on similarities, on the common and compatible features of the American self and of any possible cultural other, right? The universals you were talking about earlier on, right? That are being accepted as part of who I am as an American. And the best example, perhaps, is Carl Schurz, right? And he's consistently employing the principle of similarity to invoke a liberal model of true Americanism. Right? The equal treatment of diverse portions of American society. Then you have more difficult tropes like metaphor, yeah? Symbolic nationalism. They're counterintuitive. You can't use logic. You can't use Aristotle, yeah? And his principle of non-contradiction to understand them. But nevertheless, they are used in creating national images, not just in America. I was just giving an example, right? American history, American images. But I've done that in my book. I've done that concentrating on Romanian nationalisms. Yeah, these several ways of constructing a national image. And I've also sprinkled some examples from other countries and other cultural traditions in the book. So the melting pot, for instance, right? The pluribus unum type of image, right? With the American nation being epitomized by Freetown meetings, right? Small-scale meetings. Yeah? And also paradoxical nationalism. right? Which is a shocking identity or mutual dependency of the American self with the cultural other. You employ irony, a paradoxical, rhetorical trope, to create a dialectic of opposites where good and evil, victory and defeat are converted into each other. Right? Examples, remember Martin Luther King Jr. Seeing hope in despair when he said the American people are infected with racism. That is the peril. Paradoxically, they're also infected with democratic ideals. That is the hope. Yeah? While doing wrong, they have the potential to do right. See the conversion of wrong into right. Right? Doesn't, again, counterintuitive. Doesn't make much sense. Yeah? But it is a trope being used to construct our national reality. Or the quote, it says, post-human rights America is prone to racial paradoxes such as colorblind racism, right? Or the image of Barack Obama as somewhat of a paradox. Black but white. Manly but feminist. Alien yet familiar. Foreign but quintessentially American. And of course, dubiously Christian. Right? This is a quote from Camille Nelson, The Racial Paradox. Now, what do all these examples show is that I think, on the one hand, they're examples of different templates for nationalistic discourse, right? That counter the myth that nationalism is uniform. It's litany sung in a single voice. There's only one image of the nation. And another thing is that these examples are telling us is that nationalism is not hatred of the stranger or of another nation, of another minority. And therefore, hate mongers like Trump are not really nationalists. Right? When nationalism becomes thoughtless emotion, when it loses its ability to reshape the face of the nation and redefine its identity, nationalism becomes something else. Some people think of this as, bad or extreme or ultra-nationalism is still nationalism, but it's gone crazy, over the top, like a mean or rabid dog, right? Mad, but still a dog, right? Now, I propose a different image. I propose that the so-called extreme nationalism is to nationalism what a zombie is to a human, right? That is, it somehow resembles a human, but it has lost its humanity entirely. Right? Extreme nationalism is zombie nationalism. It's no longer nationalism at all. It's extremist, intolerant, hateful discourse, right? Of the Trumps, the Farages, the Le Pens, the Jobbiks, and whatever. Yeah? It's pseudo-nationalism. Okay? And these politicians we've been talking about, and these parties, and the public discourse of anti-you, anti-immigrants, anti-elites that they foster are not really nationalism. What are they? They've also been called populists, right? Sometimes. And I have, my own story about that. And in the end, what I say is, and I don't have time for that, is that there's a difference between respectable, legitimate populism that also has a respectable history, right? And pseudo-populism. Right? And pseudo-populism is an inherently demagogic political gambit for immediate self-serving aims that uses oversimplified, antagonistic images of the nation to exclude or damage some people in that politics. All sorts of elites, ethnic minorities, immigrants, and so on and so forth. It's discriminatory, chauvinistic, xenophobic, or racist, anti-democratic, illiberal, and even, ultimately, immoral. Right? Now, some characteristics of this pseudo-populism, it zombifies both antagonistic nationalism and populism. Yeah? And interestingly, the adversary is free-floating. It can be anybody and anything, right? And they jump from one adversary to the next. My heart goes with you, Vyacheslav.
I'll write you.
Okay, thank you. And also the people hence the title, partly explained by this. The people is also a free-floating concept. It may be identified in different ways at different times, depending on what is more convenient for that politician. Right? Now I was going to look at other features. Accelerated and short-range political action is typical of these pseudo-populists. Right? They're not thinking long-term for the benefit of the people. They're thinking quick measures, quick satisfaction. Doesn't matter if then I change my mind and I say, no, I never said that, or whatever. Yeah. And the other thing is shattered thought, speech, action continuum. Right? Inconsistent discourse action, ideologically disjointed, demagoguery, no core principles of values or beliefs, promise anything, offer immediate gratification, then radically change your tune, retract, do countermeasures, lie. I never said that. No, you misunderstood. Right? And so on and so forth. Now, I'm reaching the case study part of this. How much do I have? How much more do I have?
How much do you want?
It's bargain.
5 minutes?
Bargaining.
6?
Make it 10. Okay.
No.
All right.
Give you 6 from the beginning. And then
Right. So let's look at the Social Democratic Party, the PSD in Romania. Right now, ruling Romania. This ruling party, has assimilated this pseudo-populist discourse. We don't have an extremist party. We don't have our Jobbik anymore, right? We don't have this kind of thing. And we don't need it because the ruling party has adopted that, yeah, in a very clever, more modest way, but it's still there. So you have the same fixed schema or template, antagonism, right? That's what they do. They set people against one another. And flexible fillers. The people is indefinite. The adversary changes all the time. Foreigners are typically invoked as a ruse for political gain, not cultural self-image. Political gambit, accelerated short-range gratification. They promised huge increases in salary for the last elections. Now it turns out nothing happens. Yeah? On the contrary, some people got lower wages. Doesn't matter. Now they're changing their tune. Internally divisive and exclusionary, xenophobic. Not least of all, a lack of honor. Shameless, even when convicted. Victor Ponta, the former head of the party, a proven but unrepenting plagiarist, and his PhD. The current leader, Liviu Dragnea, is a convicted felon with a suspended 2-year sentence for trying to interfere with a referendum, for Christ's sake. Talking of populism, with a referendum, right? To dismiss the president. And obviously, ideologically, totally disjointed, free-floating demagoguery, inconsistent discourse action, shattered thought, speech, action continuum, right? But I also want to look at the counter-discourse. What the people, another the people, has mounted as an anti-PSD discourse, right? The difference is that the features of Romania's PSD discourse, in spite of its looseness and disjointed nature, it is very unified, it's monotonal, a single, ready-made, simplistic template for the nation, and that's antithesis. I fight for you, the people, against the enemy. That's the simplest way of putting it, right? The features of the, for instance, the movement known now as the hashtag resist anti-PSD discourse. Multitonal. All nationalistic templates are represented there. Although national images are mostly condensed or only implicit, right? And now let's quickly look at it to see how that works. This is a movement that peaked in February, yeah, against attempts from this government to legalize corruption, basically. So look at the massive turnout, right? Almost, for some people, almost 300,000 participants in Bucharest, 600,000 across the country, largest demonstration since December 1989. It has a nationalist agenda attached to it. Yeah, national flag and anthem, always present there. And they're narrating a new political history of the national community in a different voice, a voice that is more personalized. Yeah? I am doing for my children what my parents could not do for me. So they're creating a history. My family history is the history of the country. Yeah? Is representative for the history of my parents are the parents who did the revolution, contributed to the revolution of 1989. Right? They tried, but they couldn't change the system. We still have these bloody communists, so I'm trying, in my turn, to do something for my children. I hope I'm doing more than what my parents did. And that creates a historical narrative on it. And you have all the templates that I've been talking about, right? The radical antagonistic national images, the counter-antagonism of the crowd, right? The slogans that they're chanting, right? You can see that they're oppositional. The imprecations and the sarcasm and the belittling of the powerful, right? Dragna's mom, can you come out of the house to play with? Because they wouldn't confront the people, right? Okay. And the answer is no, because he steals. The mom supposedly says. And Iordache, who was the Minister of Justice, who was instrumental to the attempt to legalize corruption, was called Ciordache, which is, you've seen the etymology of that. And the puns there using Dragna's name, right? Dragnea fila pușcărie, or we don't believe you, right? Okay. Another one is, this is Iordache, the Minister of Justice, right? Who famously in one interview wouldn't answer any of the questions from the journalists because they were awkward. No, because they were awkward, he had no reply. So he would rapidly say, another question, right? And then someone else, another question, right? Another question, until he found a question that he could answer, right? Another question, altă întrebare, but întrebare in Romanian also sounds like between bars, like put in between bars. Okay. You also have the liberal, analogical images based on similitude between Romanian national values and European values, right? Civic values. And you can see how they were working a European symbol, in the crowd. Okay? You have the similarity in chants like, I want a country like the countries abroad. And they're obviously talking about these Eastern, European Union and Western countries. I want to live my childhood in a democracy, and so on and so forth. And Dragna, remember, this is my country too. This is not just a country for one part of the population set against another. This is for all of us. We have to share, right? And so on and so forth. And I think it's interesting, the last one, right? Typically, the PSD voters are older people, right? So one of the protesters was holding out a sign saying, "Yes, Mom, I'm wearing warm clothes," right? Suggesting at least two things. It's ambiguous, right? A willingness to acknowledge these voters, these other Romanians who did not share their opinions, right? And try to mitigate the gap between them in a loving way, but also showing that even these diverse constituencies, young and old, are consensual in their respect of the rule of law, right? So it doesn't matter if they voted for you, they still don't like what you're doing, right? And then the metaphoric or anarchist symbols, right? Using the metaphors to imagine a country. That's an implicit, mostly implicit, less explicit than the other ones. It's implicit because it's the tacit anarchist platform that is apparent in the decentralized, spontaneous, participative, democratic manner of organizing the demonstration, contributing to these demonstrations, mostly through social media. It's kind of an informal referendum. Yeah, people just showed up in the streets and they generated this informal referendum. And also bringing children as a metaphor. yeah, of innocence, of purity, of the future, yeah, doing politics with, yeah, interest in the consequences for my children, for the future generations, and educating them, using education rather than immediate political interest as a symbol, right? And you also have a conservative, a more conservative in the sense of a paradoxical view, an ironic view of the national image, ironically accepting insults and calumny, and even parading them with pride. Yeah? A public display of alleged secret machinations. Of course, first they immediately said, this is Soros funding this demonstration, right, against us because he hates Romania, he wants this to happen. So people in the street went on saying, Soros, if you're seeing this, the money still hasn't reached me. What's going on? You're supposed to pay for this. Where's my money? Right? Or Soros, consider giving me a bonus for difficult working conditions, because this was February, February weather in the winter. Okay? Or converting offensive labels into a proud cognomen, right? They were called hooligans, right? Soros men, Sorosist, right? Better a Sorosist than a communist, or better a hooligan than a liar, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. So what's wrong with? Hopefully now we see that what's wrong with calling people who want to generate a new image for the country, yeah, by the same name as people like Trump, Dragna, right, or all of these other politicians we've been talking about. Yeah, what is wrong with that? Well, conflating nationalism and pseudo-nationalism can delegitimize, can ignore national sentiments and interests, and it pauperizes people's collective identity, their sense of solidarity, of belonging, of responsibility, and it pushes them to embrace extremist reactions just because you refuse nationalism, you refuse this as a legitimate activity, as a legitimate state of mind. Using populism as a derogatory label may also discard social justice together with it, and public involvement in political decision-making. It may increase the feeling of powerlessness of the common people. And perhaps we need to recalibrate the balance of elite, representative democracy, and participative democracy. I think we also need to be more tolerant of alternative ways of conceiving the nation that are not necessarily exclusionary. And I have to insist on that. Let's not be contaminated. Let's not contribute to what Dorota was calling the dichotomous, divisive, brutal, new linguistic behavior in your speech at the beginning of the conference, right? Yeah. Perhaps we should complement our more technical concepts with moral tones and stance, right? Perhaps we should introduce, I know Raul has an objection to that, but perhaps we should introduce demagoguery as a relevant concept. Not all politicians are demagogues in the same way. As I was saying, it's one thing to promise 5.6 increase in whatever economic chapter and have instead 4.9, right? Or run into trouble, because of an international context and not being able to do that, although you're trying desperately to do it, right? That's one thing. But to say, I'm going to increase your wages and then seize power and do the opposite, right? I'm going to do that and not care about that at all. I think that's lying. That's the demagoguery. It's Serbia, right? Okay. And it's shattering the thought, speech, action continuum, right? And we need to take public stand against what we conceive as wrong, irrespective of our ideologies, and lying, corruption, civic issues. We need to reinsert cultural criteria in the study of nationalism. Divergencies, translatability, the speed of social change, all these things are cultural criteria that need to be considered, right? And we need to consider cultural mediation between communal selves and cultural others, because possibly one of the reasons why things are happening is not economic reason, is not social reason, is not but maybe it is our lack of mediating different communities within the same nation, right? Or within the same political organization like the European Union. Pay more attention to discourse styles, genres and structures, because discourse is both a form of understanding and a form of social action. And consider perhaps the material importance, the concreteness of abstract or imagined communities, right? Professor Krosh was saying, right? The abstract community is different from the concrete community. Imagined communities, that they are concrete, they have a concreteness. For a healthy moral society, you need to understand that material importance of such things. And how do you do it? I think that is a reflex of the level and the quality of humanistic education. That's why I agree with Ross. That only humanistic education provides the platform for understanding cultural identities. Right? The exact sciences are good, computers, IT sciences are good, but they won't offer you, as a young, growing conscience, they don't offer you the tools to understand identities and work with them. So that's it. That's my presentation.
Now we'll be taking questions.
Okay.
Or comments, disagreements, challenges,
Absolutely, yeah. Expect that.
antagonisms. Barbara.
I sort of think that definition in social science is a suicide mission, so I'm impressed with. So that's why I have a question. I never did this. How do you manage to find criteria to distinguish these different notions on the level label of the notion and definition by some features? Because what you define as a real populism, I usually define on the intuitive way, of course, as a socialism.
Right. There are definitely overlaps. Yeah.
Could you explain how you do systematization of these different notions?
At this point, the only thing you can say, again, populism was something that I incidentally, right?
Touched upon.
Yeah, well, touched upon. My interest is nationalism, but populism, I think you look at first of all, you look at the historical evolution, right? You look at the history of the phenomenon, and that brings already an alarm, right? Saying, wait a second, populism is not necessarily what you think populism is, because you're just looking at today, and
You
what is
mean
happening
history
today.
of how people use the word?
How people use not just the word, because there's more than a word to populism. It's a political practice.
If I can comment something, it's the historical manifestations of populism that I've identified as such. The first being the Nationalisms.
Sure.
The term is associated with Nationalism. They had a left-wing platform. There were intellectuals who were going to villages, trying to improve the situation of the peasantry in Tsarist Russia in the 19th century. There was an American Populist Party, which was agrarian and actually bottom-up, so based on farmers. They actually were not elites, they were genuine people, grassroots. It was called as such American Populist Party, again, at the end of the 19th century. So this is where the term started being used. And the literature dealing with contemporary populism completely ignores these two examples. Although, and the third main use, historical use, is for Latin American populism, which brings us closer a bit to the one today, because it was right-wing authoritarian dictatorial, but it was state populism. So it was established after military coup d'etat in various countries in South America. But these are the three historical examples of populism where people either self-identified as populists or had this explicitly in the name of the organization. So this is the historical populism, I think, that you were talking about.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Except that with the Latin American populism, which is invoked by Mude, for instance, good nationalism versus good populism versus bad populism.
Yes.
Right? This is bad populism, and then I need to work with that because it doesn't make logical sense, right? How can you have the same thing? How can you provide a definition for something and say you have the good and the bad, right? You reach the absurd conclusion that you have good chauvinism and bad chauvinism, or the other way around, yeah?
Okay, now Tamara.
But it is a difficult problem. I recognize that it is a difficult problem. How do you define it? It is suicidal to a certain extent, but just because it's difficult, doesn't mean you don't have to do it. You have to, because otherwise we're talking about stuff, we think we know what we're talking about stuff, but we're thinking of different things, and then we're providing solutions for them, supposedly, and we realize it doesn't work. Why? Because we're thinking of different things. Or we're conflating different things under one name. Or we're using two different names for the same thing, right? And how can you work with that? So you have to try. You have to try. You fail, someone else comes with a better definition, counter argument, sure, go ahead. And this is an ongoing process. What else is there to be done? Right?
Tamara.
Thank you very much. It was a great lecture and it made me reconsider my own work. Well, since submitting the free paper, I already found many things I don't like in my paper, but now I have even more. First, I do consider all the things that you mentioned in the first part of the speech about a need for a more nuanced view of the nationalism. But when I start the second step and go to the analysis of discourse, I'm taking one highly normative view of nationalistic discourse. For me, I can imagine nationalism and analyze it in a very nuanced way. But when I enter the discourse itself, I cannot. Maybe in fact I'm confusing it with chauvinism, but
right.
Maybe something like that. I cannot imagine a good nationalistic discourse. And
okay, we'll take more questions.
A completely other question. How do you see the emancipatory potential of humor in political action? And do you see the limits? Where do you see the limits? Thank you.
Can I ask a related question to those?
No, another question. You're Daka, right? No, I'm joking.
Don't
right?
quote the wrong persons, you know.
Okay.
Very briefly, it's all very convincing and working and logical and brilliant,
Get to the
obviously. And how would I say that? It's a very good work that you're doing, actually intellectual labor, backing up your division, which puts nationalism on the constructive side of political action, in fact, not only discourse but action, and chauvinism on the destructive side. It's very convincing, as I said, and it's, I would even say, visionary. And I might subscribe to a party like this. Then I would be a nationalist of the good type, and I would feel good. And the examples of demonstrations were very interesting, because we could say that the same has been happening in Poland in all those anti-law and justice politics against the constitutional tribunal and judiciary, etc. They all obviously contain a strong national core. We are doing it in the name of, you know, the nation that is being endangered by the ruling camp, the whole state, etc. So, and it makes me feel, these demonstrations, very assertive in my identity as a Polish person. Yeah? So it makes me a nationalist according to these definitions, and I'm not ashamed of it. But
Okay.
I think you've touched on that. On the one hand, what you're doing is an attempt to construct a visionary program by rearranging the field of definitions, yeah? I could say semiosphere of the word and the discourse around it. And it's not bad, obviously, even though the point is, how about language as behavior in political practice? How do you plan, let's say, if you were to go further with your vision, to let's say, implement your proposition into real political, public as well, and intellectual discourse, how to make it circulate and how to make people convinced that what happens on the destructive side is not nationalism, but chauvinism, demagoguery, and so on. What if other people will tell you it's a matter of definitions, of how we use words, ignoring maybe some other uses that are actually in practice? And do you want to answer, to take another question?
Let's
Maybe-
take another question.
Yeah, okay.
This is gonna be long.
Oh my
Okay,
God, no,
stop.
Answer those two
Okay.
first and then you.
You can imagine a good nation. All right? What I provided you.
Discourse. I
A
can't.
good nationalist discourse, right, okay. Now, these people that are in the streets, they're providing for you a template for how to construct the nation, reconstruct the nation, because the nation has been damaged by communism, right? It has been damaged by the post-communist governments, right? The predatory elites that took over, right? Corruption and so on and so forth. Now they want to legalize it, right? So they institutionalize corruption in a way.
Yeah.
Okay. So you want to reconstruct that. How do you do it? You look at these people, they're offering templates, right? They're offering templates.
But it sounds more like a patriotic discourse than.
Right, but nationalism is not, okay, you want to be a patriot. You love your country. What is it that you love? How do you know what to love? How can you identify it as your country? Don't you need a national image for that? So that you know what to love?
Or the institutions.
No, not the institutions necessarily, but a national image. Yeah? Because even love is a form of discourse. You are putting your emotions, you're putting something you feel inside of you into a discursive frame, right? Okay? So, patriotism for me is not nationalism at all. Because I have examples of nationalism that is not patriotic necessarily. It's not, oh, I love my country. I would die for my country. Not at all, right? On the contrary, you can have nationalist discourse, national images that say my country is rotten, my country is, in shambles. I hate my country. I need to, do something about it. Okay? I don't like it. I don't even like it. Not that I don't love it. Yeah? Self-hatred. Yeah? A very crazy form of nationalism,
It's
right?
called auto-chauvinism in Serbia.
Auto-chauvinism, exactly, yes. Very good name, yeah. Okay? Self-loathing, self-hatred, especially for victimized nations, right? Historically. So there's lots of ways in which you can be nationalist, but not necessarily a patriot, right? And again, not necessarily chauvinistic, right? You're just constructing yourself. Nationalism, constructing a national image is like your collective GPS. It orients you in the world. You have to know where you are, who you are, in relationship to other reference points. Okay? That's what it is. Raul was first.
My question too.
Right, okay, your question.
Come on.
She's too close.
Yeah.
She's so close.
Wrapping
I
up
forgot.
quickly. Yeah. And
Okay. First of all, and humor, yes. But actually, we don't have. Yes, humor in politics, definitely. Humor. Irony is a form of humor, right? Irony is a form of humor, right? It is. Because it makes you smile at least, right? It's not devastating humor like sarcasm, for instance, right? That's destructive humor. You can destroy someone with humor. But it's clever humor that makes you think that you have an irony, for instance, and putting things in a paradoxical way. Right? Whenever I talk about irony and paradox to my students and provide them with the examples, they laugh. Right? Because then when I say, this sentence is false. Well, if it's false, and it's not true, then it's false. It's true. And if it's true, then it's false. And then they realize the paradox and they go, ah, and there's a smile on their face because they realize the complications. They understand stuff, right? Okay, so humor, but there's a lot to talk about that.
Yeah.
And to Dorota, I can't answer the question. First of all, because I'm not a visionary. I'm not putting up a visionary program at all. I'm just trying to analyze something. I'm not suggesting a program, right? I'm suggesting that we need. I'm suggesting that we take a moral stand together with our scientific approaches, with our academic approaches.
So it's a
right?
program, I think.
It is programmatic, but not visionary. I'm not envisaging something, whatever. Secondly, you're asking me how to implement something. I'm just providing you with the analytical tools to analyze something. I don't know how to implement a change in the existence that, it's like asking some inventor, who came up with an invention, but how do you market it? The poor guy doesn't know how to market it, how to implement it in real life. He just thought of it. That's a great idea. I came up with a discovery. I don't know how to use it, in business, right? That's someone else doing it. So I need someone else to help with that. I can't tell you. I mean, I could, but who am I? I'm not good at it. So, yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
first of all, I think it's really convincing in acting as a complement to what Miroslav was saying on the first day. I think I see better through your presentation his notion of this new nationalism as being emptied out of the contents that used to be there in the nationalist movement. I'm convinced by that. I find your metaphor of the zombie excellent.
What about the zombie? I can't hear
I
it.
find your metaphor of the zombie excellent in terms of nationalism as deprived of this humanistic content that both Miroslav and yourself were speaking about is convincing. But he also mentioned something which I find is important, keeping this in mind, and I'm wondering if you can comment on this. He was mentioning that this happens because this affiliation to the nation is no longer voluntary. That through the nation state and through citizenship, we sort of become attached to the nation whether we like it or not. Whereas this nationalism that he was talking about, the 19th century, 20th century one, which I think is in some ways what, I know what you're proposing is a new project, but it's trying to recover some of the original juice of the 19th century nationalism and its emancipatory potential. So, what would you have to say about this voluntariness and its possibilities in the context of the nation state? The second part relates to what Dorota said, and I think what you are saying also relates to what Vyacheslav was saying this morning. These projects, piecemeal projects, and you were mentioning it yesterday in a question, in a Q&A, that you can have you were mentioning the examples of the Romanian protests for, I don't know, the collective
civic issues.
Thing, it's various separate issues. And Vyacheslav this morning was also giving us a potential solution addressing piecemeal issues, this road, that kindergarten. How do we make this sustainable? And you can say you're not proposing a political project, but you are. So, this is a genuine question I have, and I had for Vyacheslav as well. When you try to make it sustainable beyond an action in a certain space on a certain issue, it has to be bound by a certain ideology. When you try to configure that ideology, you necessarily leave out this anarchic notion of responding piecemeal to things, which is nice and pretty and pragmatic, but it has to be united by something where it cannot be sustained. These protests were fine for a week or two and then they disappear. And they might come again for a different issue. It can be ecological, it can be something else, and they will go again. This is not the movement that will transform Romania, this is not the movement that will change the political system. This will change an issue. And that's it.
Oh, it's good if it changes the issue.
Of course it's good, but it's not
Before it didn't.
it's not a challenge to new nationalism. Third, you mentioned alternative ways of conceiving nationalism that are not necessarily exclusionary, and here is where we part ways. Because
Wait, say again, please.
as you mentioned, and I quote, alternative ways of conceiving nationalism that are not necessarily exclusionary.
Right.
And I said that this is where we part ways.
Mhm.
I think nationalism has to be exclusionary, because the nation has to have a boundary. That boundary can be many things. It can be extended, it can be permeable, you can let certain groups in, certain groups out, but there has to be a boundary. The definition of, if it doesn't have a boundary, then we're talking universals, we're not talking nations. Nations have to have a boundary, and that boundary excludes, just as it includes. And that brings me to my other comment, which is again, all this sounds pretty. The constructive and the destructive side could be separated. I think they can be separated analytically. I'm not sure about in practice in politics. Historically speaking, that hasn't happened. You're talking about this effervescence against the corrupt government, and I loved it as a Romanian from abroad saying this. But my fascists in the interwar period would do exactly the same at their rallies. They would rally against the government that was objectively corrupt, incompetent, stealing, and so on. And they would think they're doing the right thing because they were protesting against the bad thing, and they had a feeling of community, and they all felt good. And I think that's what I was trying to say in my presentation, that exclusionary nationalist projects have this positive side where they want to see a community emerge. But this has to be predicated on the exclusion of someone or something. And I don't see this going away in practice. I don't see the destructive side going away because we choose to focus on the constructive side. And nationalism, again, historically started with the constructive side. The destructive side came later. And I think, like I was saying to Miroslav's presentation, I think it comes pretty much at the limit when the emancipatory project is complete. When you have included all the in-group in terms of social, gender, other criteria, when your boundaries are as full as they can be, that's when you have to activate the destructive side. That's where you reach the limit of your inclusiveness. Finally, that's conceptual. I really like your scheme of discourses, thought, speech, action, inspired by Vodak and your own take on it. But there's one part missing in it, and there's a Foucaultian, I have to bring it up, power.
Yeah.
These discourses all have power implications. When Mill and Herder are disagreeing, they disagree for good reason. Mill's discourse justifies the British Empire. Herder is a German who is an upcoming power that wants to be acknowledged as an equal to something like the British Empire. So of course Herder would argue for equal worth, and Mill will argue for inclusion of inferior cultures. Even funnier, I think, is the Marx and Lenin controversy. So Marx wants this inclusive world revolution. He thinks that it's absolutely no problem for inferior cultures to be swallowed up by it. Lenin has a direct interest in decolonization because that would destroy his enemies. So Lenin has this ultimate self-determination, the tiniest region, the tiniest village that wants to be independent can be so. And this is fantastic, but they are political projects. They're not innocent statements, they're not purely analytical statements. They have a concrete content related to power and to their historical implications. That's at least my take on it.
Yeah.
And
Thank you.
Shall I take on?
So maybe Helge, and we'll end with Bogdan's answers. Make it short.
I'm short. I'm not tall. So, first, I think you can make value judgments without having a national project.
Without having a national?
Project.
All right.
Yes. You can demonstrate against corruption. I know that corruption is wrong without having a national project.
Sure, yeah.
So, maybe it's a danger when we are discussing new nationalism that everything is related to the nation, to conceive everything related to the nation. So just saying maybe more comment, but maybe something we should reflect on. Then those master tropes. Well, master tropes, it's always difficult to how to organize things in those master tropes. When you say, I think the melting pot is more in melting pots. Discourse is more in the symbolic. You can also put it in the anti-racism because we can say, well, we have the ethnic pure nation and those are the native. This is a melting pot. So how do you take some of these cases? So there's a difficulty. I just wanted to look into that. And another is the process of harmonization, harmonizing.
Yeah.
This is a process, never ends, in fact. There is no
Yeah.
end of this process. So, so you always have a group, several groups inside or outside a national territory and inside or excluded or included. It's inspiring inclusion whatsoever that challenge harmony. So, what to do with this? Is this contradictory to nationalism?
You're talking about harmonizing groups,
Harmonizing
a society?
Society.
Right, okay. I was talking about something else. I was talking about harmonizing your view of the past with your view of the future. That's all. Harmonizing your historical narrative with your political project.
Okay.
Not harmonizing groups. Okay, so, no, my mistake, because I was doing things quickly and too much, too short a time. Yeah. All right, okay. Look, if it's, okay, I'm not going to answer. All right?
No, answer.
Can I answer?
No,
Because you're saying it takes too
Of
long.
course you have to answer. But
All right, fine. Let's take it here.
Don't look at my face, I'm just tired, but I'm interested.
I'm just jacked up because I'm here and having to respond. Otherwise,
No,
I'm
I see what
I know. So, the melting pot can be interpreted in various ways. Yes, definitely. Okay? So, I can put up a trope, an image, yeah? And it's going to be taken up by someone else, and its meaning and its function and how it works in a different context is going to change, obviously. Right? But the fact still remains that I said it in a certain context, and it does have in that context a certain, somewhat of a certain meaning and a certain function. And that's what I'm looking at. The change, the dynamics of this change, yes, is very important. Absolutely. And that's why I say nationalism is an ongoing project. A nation is an ongoing project. It never is a snapshot at one moment in time. Yes, that. Also, something else. I haven't had time to discuss it, but there's an essential deep structure rhetoric of these master tropes, which means it's how you structure your understanding. You structure your understanding based on antagonisms. And everything is an antagonism, right? Class antagonism, power, everything is an antagonism, right? Or you structure your views based on similitude, right? So you're looking for similar features, you're looking for categories, you're looking for laws and principles that work universally, and so on and so forth. You structure it using your metaphor, metaphoric imagination, or paradoxical understanding, dialectics, and so on and so forth, right? So these are the deep structure, master tropes, that structure your understanding and the way you perceive how to act. You conceive of how to act. And then there's a superficial rhetoric. Yeah? The ornamental tropes, yeah? Rhetorical, stylistic devices that make you sound nice, convincing, impressive, yeah? Moving people, touching people, yeah? Stuff like that. But that's on a different level. And it doesn't have that structuring power of master tropes, right? It's just a coat that you put on, right? To use an old metaphor, okay? And you can protest without a national project? Yes, absolutely. Yes, of course. I never said you can't. I was just saying that these people had a project. That they were trying in this spontaneous way to implement a new national project. That's all I was saying. I'm not saying you can't protest without a national. Sure you can.
No.
Back,
Raoul,
are you kidding me?
cutting the question.
I have this load to answer to from Raoul.
I didn't.
Power, yes, of course it's important. Absolutely. I teach cultural studies. How can I ignore power? Yes, of course. But power doesn't necessarily mean you have to be bad using it. right? You have to be a villain, you have to be an asshole, right? Or you have to be a pure innocent victim of power,
You might.
right? Power can be used or abused. As you know, remember that Schindler's List dialogue between Schindler and the crazy Nazi who was shooting people randomly, and he said, that's not power. Real power is you can shoot them, but you don't. You choose not to. That's real power, right? So the real power is not to use power randomly or, just for these, because it's a kind of a drug. Power is a drug, ultimately. You get intoxicated with it. Okay. Voluntary affiliation, right? I think that if you're looking at nations and national images the way I'm looking at them, it's not a question of affiliating yourself, that is, swearing allegiance, but you are part of a nation willy-nilly. Why do I say that? It's willy-nilly because, first of all, you're brainwashed into being part of a nation through education from an early age. That's one way of looking at it. The other is, you cannot not be part of a nation. Because in the historical context that we are experiencing, a national belonging to a nation is not something abnormal, and it's not something you can choose to do, right? It's a utopian thought to think you can refrain from being part of a nation. I'm not
And
really
if you're
a national.
a minority,
I'm a citizen of the world. I think that's utopia to me.
if you're a minority,
If you have a great passport.
Right, a nation, and that's the other thing. Good. That brings me to another question. Nationalism has to be exclusionary.
Yeah.
Only if we take a nation to be the same thing as a state. With a territory.
No.
With a territory. Because exclusionary, let's define exclusionary. What do we mean by it? Exclusionary can be understood as in a destructive, negative way. Yeah? I want to kick someone out. From where? You kick them out from a territory, right? From a space, right? I want to destroy someone because they're destroying my purity, right? This is something too concrete. We're talking about imagined communities. We're talking about the imagination. And in my imagination, I don't have to do that. Yeah? I can construct my nation without any... I'll give you an example. Blaga. Okay? Lucian Blaga, a Romanian poet-philosopher who is one of the pillars of the Romanian national images, right? He created a certain symbolic space for the nation. He was looking at the nation using kind of a Jungian, abysmal imagination, whatever. It sounds...
It's highs and lows.
In the highs and lows, yeah. And it's very harmonious, and it doesn't say anything about, except for these fuckers that we need to kick out of the country, right? It said nothing about the other. It simply disregarded the other, creating this harmonious image that symbolizes what a Romanian is. And that's all. It can be done. It was done.
It's a lyrical project, and he's so much of an exception in the Romanian cultural space. The exception.
It's not. It's not.
He is.
It's not.
Name another one.
Vâlsan.
Who?
Vâlsan, George Vâlsan.
Don't know.
Geographer who in 1918, when the country was reunited, gave the inaugural talk at the university in Cluj, right? Symbolic space.
Okay.
And he was using a metaphor simply to talk about continuity. Moshi și strămoși. Moshie. And he was playing with these terms, not saying anything about how we had to fight this or that, or how this is the enemy. You can do it. You can actually do it if you look at the history. And I'm providing example in the book, right? So I think logically you can conceive of this, and historically there are examples. So I'm not convinced that it has to be exclusionary. It is exclusionary in the sense that I am not thinking about the other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's all. That's all. But is that something bad? When I create my own individual identity, do I have to consider the other? Do I have to include the other necessarily? I'm just constructing myself, right? Yes, you are. Yeah.
Like if there is some.
Your relationship with the other doesn't have to be seen in antagonistic, exclusionary terms. I can introduce the other in the equation, in like Neuka was doing, for instance, in Romania.
Sure.
Yeah. See, Neuka was a wonderful example. He was talking about well, okay. I understand.
Could carry on this discussion because
Yeah.
we would have many more examples,
Yeah.
pro and many more
Sure.
counter examples.
We'll talk. We'll talk after,
Bauman
right,
was
Raoul?
talking about how Jews became excluded from national communities and so on.
I don't agree.
All right, listen, guys and girls, everyone. So I think this has been a wonderful wrapping up, in fact, discussion for the whole conference.
Also a request for some general remarks. Maybe can be-
Unless we have
Yeah.
some general remarks from the floor to wrap it up even more. You can also wrap up, Bogdan, if you want. You have the
But
voice
not more
now.
than 5 minutes. And then we would also like to make an announcement about the publication. We made a commitment, but you're not that populist, so we will stick to the
Non-committal
commitment.
commitment.
Something about that. But first,
Comments.
comments. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I just thought.
Maybe you can also introduce
Yes,
yourself.
my name is Tim Krüger. I'm from Wrocław Technical University, and my background is in natural sciences, in physics and mathematics, but I'm doing a lot of mathematical models for social contagion processes, let me say it that way. So that's why my interest also came here to attend this conference. And I just would like to make maybe a personal view of what I was missing in the conference and what I would like to question people maybe to focus a little bit. The majority of talks I have seen here, we are barely relying on real data. And that was certainly, with a few exceptions like Pierre Schaepers today and some others, which I find wonderful. I think it's really easily fall into a trap because our senses usually overestimate the real size and scale of some changes, especially if the changes make a lot of noise, right, in the public media. And then it's like in the magnifying glass, we see things enormously large, the terrorism debate as well. And theories and concepts are certainly important for structuring your thoughts and get a way to reflect and interpret the data which eventually we have. But if you introduce a new concept, a category, a definition or so in natural sciences, say, you immediately ask yourself how I can measure them. Can I really find indicators at least, which somehow tells me in which situation I am? So, and that was, I was missing here, that when you introduce new concepts, a lot of concepts you speak about, but also in previous talks, I think it would be maybe good to imagine what set of questions I would like to would have to ask a person to classify him more or less uniquely into my categories, assuming that the person doesn't know anything about my definition, of course. And then you see that some of the things are not quite hard actually to estimate. And this is a problem as I consider as a very serious one. And I just mentioned an old saying by Galileo Galilei that science is measuring the measurable and finding measures for the unmeasurable. And I think it's as true 500 years, as it was 500 years ago as it is right now. And I think it's something which one should really keep maybe a little bit in mind when building up a lot of fancy concepts and theories to see really, can I do it in a quantitative, empirical, scientific way? And this is a challenge I think I would like to put into the room and maybe
turning into a real science.
well,
As a
You can join us and then do it.
No, I know.
Today, the data set, the database is much better than ever before because we have access to huge social data. And I've been on many conferences on what is called now social informatics, where the people actually exactly try to take out from all of the fingerprints you left in the social media information about changes or more complex structures. And I'd just like to see
But in fact, I think we would need to define first what we mean by measure in various sciences, because in the humanities, obviously, the measure could be different. So definitely these questions would be very legitimate to ask. I think some of them have been asked. The data was there in, for example, the shape of textbooks at schools or texts of culture, of various kinds, images and so on. These are our data very often. Not only the data that you can gather from people's utterances, these as well. So I think the data was there all the time hovering, and it has been measured, but these, the questions that you posed are very legitimate. You could think about the project.
Case studies in social sciences, right? You analyze deeply all your concepts, a few cases. But to estimate trends in the society, and as we speak about new nationalism, it's certainly regarded as either it's growing, either it's a new threat or something. Single case studies are not enough. You read really the population scale of something. And that is a difficult task really to manage. And
Expensive.
Hannah.
I think that, there are, I don't think that I think it's not necessarily the business of people in this room to project, to project things. I think that we sort of have a different agenda, which I think it's that the natural sciences have a very legitimate agenda, and the kinds of research that you mentioned, and but research in the humanities has a different type of agenda, a different way that we define what data is, what research is, what research sets are. Not resigning from the objectivity of that we are also striving for. I think it's about how we define science. It's for us. It's no longer the natural sciences that are setting the trend for how we believe that research should be done. I think those are a little bit two different worlds, but it would be great to bridge them. I mean, it would be great to have you in the next conference to present.
I completely agree with to extend what we're saying. I mean, every science defines a little bit its method, but the data are the basis of finally deciding also between concepts and theories. And that is becomes an interdisciplinary task. It's certainly clear, and you have also to look out. I mean, you know the details, and then you can better imagine what a proper question that things ask. So it's
No, it would make it easier in certain parts of our own humanistic sciences to have, for instance, a database of all nationalist text, right? In a certain, have them together and digital humanities and stuff like that.
I mean, that would be a big style.
There's a
To
project.
make it, just like in social science, we bring together all the stuff.
Absolutely,
So that anyone
Or
could gain free access to these data.
Sure.
And then you make a leap that's
Absolutely.
worthwhile.
Or measure the
There are
impact
two
of
projects I can recommend just off the top of my head. One is, the abbreviation is EARN, stands for Encyclopedia of Romantic Nationalism in Europe. It's a huge database of texts, national anthems, songs, poems of 19th century Romantic nationalism, the classic form of nationalism. 19th century? Extremely important. Extremely important. If we don't understand 19th century nationalism, we don't understand nationalism.
We need a follow-up.
Okay, then 20th century and potentially 21st century is another one called DIAN, stands for Digital Infrastructure for the Analysis of National Movements in Europe. That's supposed to cover...
Just spell it?
DIAN. It's
Okay.
a digital infrastructure for the analysis of national movements in Europe.
Okay.
The network that generated these two projects, we've recently put together an application for a European grant called Nationalism in a Digital Age. It deals both with the implications of digital age for nationalism and methodologically with how can we use digital tools to study nationalism. If the grant is successful, it's going to be another database that we use, and that one is geared towards the present, so it's not past tense project, but something we want to do. So this stuff is getting developed, but there is something I would say about this big data. As a historian, I don't trust it. I'm sorry, but the scheme you showed us did not predict the peace victory in 2015. The victory of the Poles, I mean, you were showing us a scheme where nationalism in Poland was declining, and then all of a sudden you have a spike in 2015. Based on my work in the archives, working on the interwar period, the 19th century Romania, in Romania, I predicted when Obama was elected, the next president after Obama will be a fascist. You can believe me or not, I can, I have people who witnessed that and told me afterwards, how the hell did you know? But qualitative methods allow you to have insights that quantitative methods can't give you. And that's a methodological bias. I mean, of course I think my methods are better, and you think yours are better. And we have different types of data. And the cool thing would be actually, yes, like you said, to combine it. And what I'm missing from this point of view is neuroscience. Why is there no neuroscientist ever interested in discussing this? Because there have been advances in neuroscience, and the little I can understand.
But they examine very little chunks of reality. For example, very little utterances,
Sure.
not big structures.
Sure.
Too complicated.
But Trump has a very little brain.
And I just made two short comments to what you said.
Yes.
The last one with the neuroscience. I found from 2016 a paper in Nature entitled, which was telling that nationalism and patriotism,
Yeah.
together, is a matter of the distribution of grey matter in your brain. So they wrote an article.
Was it Chomsky, maybe?
This is
I think I've read, something like this by Chomsky.
Things like this.
Seriously.
And the first one,
I would need to see. No, or maybe it was Lakoff. Lakoff
making
talks about
a
it.
prediction of the elections. For that you need more dynamic things and also to short-term mind changes. But a friend of mine who's actually sociophysics, Serge Galam, has in summer last year, on the base of the opinion formation model, a mathematical model where he put the data available for the US in, predicted the Trump victory in a quite interesting way. I'm not saying that it's telling all of the story, but he was completely off the statistical prognosis, and finally he was right. And I think it's a nice instance of an interdisciplinary way to approach things. If you really want to see what are microscopic mechanisms, I'm building such type models as well, and usually you face the problem. What happens if three people interact just in a discussion?
Sure.
What's going on? Right? How I can measure this? Do I change a little bit? Do I just become in your position because you don't like your face? And if you look for measurements, it's almost empty. Nobody is almost looking precisely at this kind of things.
Okay, I think you conclude this very interesting intervention. Now about the publication, we got a commitment from the European Review. That's the journal of the Academia Europaea. That's published by Cambridge University Press. It's very nice. They could publish a thematic issue which could contain 12 papers. So we would make a selection from all the papers that are offered, including the papers of the keynote speakers. But the problem, so that's very nice that they made that promise. But the problem is that they can only give us space at the end of 2019 or 2020. And I'm afraid that the new nationalism, Cambridge University Press, that the new nationalism will be a bit old then, or our papers will.
No, I mean,
but
the optimistic side of it is that we would have time to write our papers,
that's true.
and they would go through the reviewing process, etc., etc. Because obviously, if it's like the end of 1919 for publication, yes,
For
we would need to
It
submit
should be ready in
19, the end of 1919. But it's normal for journals, I guess, because they're always 2 years. I mean, packed at least 2 years
Even for
ahead.
edited collections, if you start putting together an edited collection for a major publisher, it would take 2 years.
Yeah, sure.
It does, yes.
So anyway, but what Siegfried wanted to say,
what I wanted to say, or
stopped
really
him.
wanted to ask, it might be that some of you are in the editorial board of a journal which could also accommodate this topic. some sociological journal, preferably an international journal. The European Review is an international journal, so it's in all the databases, international data, EBSCO, etc. So we would make your research accessible to a large audience if it would be published there. But we could, maybe there's another possibility where they could publish it sooner.
Would Nationalities papers be of interest? That's the one editorial board and not part of the speech.
Yeah, there's nations.
You put up a proposal, yeah, because there is a range. Siegfried was researching and he made a selection, but so if you have suggestions, we're,
So, but nobody is
suggestions
in
are
the
welcome.
editorial boards with some influence.
I'm an American anthropologist, but that's very specialized. It's very field. And then I'm on the board of Polish journals and Czech journals, but it's not high profile.
Yeah, local journals.
Yeah.
European Review is nice. I mean, it has its limits, 5,000 words, as few footnotes as possible. So for us in the humanities, we tend to write from 7,000 up to 10, and there is not enough space anyway. It's not enough. It's like half of your article. But they have committed themselves. But we can look elsewhere, obviously. And obviously, everything would go through the reviewing process anyway. So, but it's obvious. It's peer-reviewed and so on. But it's a nice journal, published by a respectable publisher, I think. And it's got a reasonable score of points for those countries which have points. It's got good points, and so on.
Anyway, we will send an invitation to all of you, also specifying what we expect, and maybe think of an article of 5,000 words. That's what European Review. 5,000, yeah, 5,000 words, including everything, references, and footnotes.
They like to keep footnotes to the minimum. No footnotes.
But we can send a specification.
Something.
Text reference, right?
Text reference.
Yes.
No, not MLA. But they have
They
a style
have a
sheet.
special house style.
They
Anything
have their
else about publication?
There are 2 Serbian papers which are indexed at several databases, but some of them are applying for being included into Thomson Reuters, but I think we should aim higher than that. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So we can do that.
We'll make inquiries on the way
But
anyway.
it's possible if anybody.
But anyway, when we send an invitation for you to send the abstracts, we'll try to address other publishers maybe, but obviously we need then to have a body of, to construct the proposal anyway. So it'd be like...
When will be the deadline?
You don't know
I
yet.
think for the European Review it might be the end of next year. So we'd have a year, almost more than a year. What do you think?
But only things that, it's not that much because we need to have the abstracts and then the papers and then proofreading, editing, revising. So this date does not seem to be that far away.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh yeah, explain the picture.
No, you should explain. But I can explain.
No, you
this.
found it.
The picture.
Yes.
It's an American battleship. But it was Dorota's idea, or your sister's idea.
Yeah, I have a very poor visual imagination. I might say I have no vision, and so I asked my sister, who's quite an artist and photographer, and she was sending us within like 2 days about 36 possible pictures from various areas on the internet and Heron and so on, and we decided on a destroyer. At first it was a Russian destroyer from World War II.
No.
Modern. Sorry about this. Modern. But then we thought maybe if we put up a Russian destroyer, it'd be controversial, as if, the Russians had... We wanted to underline the combative side of some new discourses that might be called nationalism, or, for example, chauvinism, or pseudo-nationalism, or whatever we call it. But anyway, this is our provisional name, and the image of it. And there was some discussion about this image, whether it's viable or not. We had other ideas, but it would be too long a story to tell. So anyway, I mean, so do you think it's totally arbitrary? Because we thought it's just very symbolic.
It's emblematic.
It's great.
Thank you. The right feedback.
All throughout the conference, I thought it was very symbolic. What exactly? But
That's how symbol functions. Actually, symbol never gives you, the exact meaning, right? The symbolism has to be open.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay.
If it's closed, it's allegory.
Close the meeting. Thank you very much for being here, and we see each other again tonight for our last supper. Not very last.
Great, thanks.
6 o'clock.
Here downstairs. Your book.
My book, yes.